And we are recording. Hey, Greg, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Aaron. Glad to be here.
Hey, we were discussing the coronavirus thing a little bit over the past week, both on Twitter and through DMs. I want to get to that in a minute. Before we get there, let's start. I want to start the show in sort of the classical way I've been doing so far, and I want to hear your perspective, sort of your local perspective. You're in California, somewhere in California, mystery spot in California. What's
And
going
just north of
on?
the Bay Area.
The Bay Area. What's going on there?
Uh, well, I think different things are going on in different parts of California, is my guess. Mostly we've had restaurants shut down in my area. We've had an extensive campaign to stay at home. A lot of people are doing that. Um, and basically, there's warnings to avoid large crowds. Grocery stores still seem to be open as far as I can tell. People need groceries, obviously, so I suspect they'll continue to remain open.
Are any of these things enforced by police, or is it advice and people should follow it and there's a campaign?
That's a great question. I think the answer might vary depending on where you're looking. For the most part, as far as I can tell, there is no legal order. I mean, I could be wrong about that, but I haven't seen any hardcore enforcement. There's no curfew as far as I know. And I, to be honest, don't expect this to last too much longer, but we'll see.
What do you know anything about what's going on in the hospitals over there?
Well, I think that to answer that question, you're going to have to talk to somebody who actually works in a hospital around here. And that's the only, and they're going to have to be somebody that you know and trust. And other than that, you're not going to get a good answer. I've seen so many different people saying so many different things online. And a lot of that is, anecdotal evidence in an attack, which is effectively what we're in the middle of right now. This isn't exactly and a lot of people have been, I think, correctly making comparisons to 9/11 between what's going on now and what happened on 9/11. And I think, we need to learn from our mistakes that we made on 9/11 and, be aware that in the midst of an attack, there is going to be a lot of chaos generated and a lot of misinformation being spread, both deliberately and accidentally.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get to that point, because that's the real reason you're on the show. We had some discussion on Twitter, which I mentioned a minute ago, and I think you were under the impression that I was spreading panic, maybe. Is that the right way to put it?
Yep.
Okay, so let's say my first. Let's start at the beginning. What is true right now? What do you think is true and what is not true? Have I been spreading mistruths in your opinion?
Well, maybe we should take a step backward from what is true to how do you figure out what is true, especially in the middle of this kind of chaos. What do I do? Let's just talk about 9/11 for a little bit. What happened on 9/11? When there was an attack, and I was in high school at that point in time. Suddenly, I was in school, and I remember all of the teachers stopping their lessons, turning on the TV, and every single channel that was news related was showing the same exact imagery, which was the towers on fire. And that was a very traumatic moment. And what's important is that we found out, later, just how much chicanery was going on 9/11, and And we know a lot more now, today, 19 years later, about what happened on that day than we did in the years following 9/11. In the years following 9/11, there was a lot of misinformation being spread around, a lot of misinformation being deliberately spread around. There was the creation of false narratives, and this was done purposefully because it was done in tandem with the attacks.
So, Greg, what are the
And
false narratives and what are the real narratives?
Well, the false narratives that were planted, or the narratives that have been picked apart, were, for example, that let's pick some of the most obvious false narratives that are still, unfortunately, hanging around today and not being corrected. That the buildings fell down because the planes crashed into them. This has been disproven multiple times by multiple entities. That it's, the buildings appeared to come down due to some form of controlled demolition with explosives. There were actually more than three buildings that came down in the World Trade Center complex. Um, there was obviously World Trade Centers 1 and 2, and then there was also World Trade Center 7, which was, I think, the most obvious example of a controlled demolition that you can possibly, hope to find. There are so many images just comparing its collapse at free fall with the collapse of, what controlled demolition looks like. So that one's kind of undeniable. And there was recently a study released from the University of Alaska that, they went and they did the homework that was supposed to be done by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. NIST was tasked with explaining how it was that WTC-7, free fell, and they came out with this very complicated report. And they came to the conclusion that fires brought down the building. Now, this is a false conclusion because for many reasons, and one of the reasons is they didn't even finish modeling the building. So when you look at the data that they use, and they put out some of their models, and they put out the video too, and the video that they put out, their model of the building, does not match the video of what happened on that day. So like even their own work disproves their narrative that they were setting.
So, what's the real story
So
then?
with 9/11, well, we could spend the entire call just on 9/11. I don't want to do that.
That's why I was trying to cut it short a little bit.
Yeah. So no, for 9/11, I encourage people to study that in depth and look at all of the research that has been put out by the 9/11 truth community, the architects and engineers for 9/11 truth. All of those people, they've been working on this for almost 2 decades now. Now, what is very dangerous is that in these traumatic moments when there's an attack, this is an opportunity for an attacker to plant a narrative. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that COVID-19 is a pre-planned attack. It could be. It might also not be. But whether or not it was or not, it nevertheless is an opportunity for people with various agendas to take a panicked and very malleable republic public, I should say, that's demanding something be done to save them from this horrible thing that's going on, to come in and suggest some very stupid solutions to their problems. Just what was done on 9/11, and we are paying. Americans are paying for the consequences of the dumb decisions the dumb reaction we decided to take in response to the real attacks on 9/11. And so that's kind of the point that I want to make here quite strongly, is that there's a lot of information being spread on Twitter, and for any kind of point of view, almost any theory, you can find some sort of supporting evidence for it. A lot of it is hearsay or whatever. My sister's a nurse, and they're having a horrible situation, and likewise you can hear stories of people saying, oh well, there's basically nothing going on at the hospitals, they're completely empty basically. And so just about any narrative you can find. So So I recommend people first, calm down, before making any decisions. Look at all of the evidence available before rushing into, some kind of pre-planned narrative that somebody might propose to try to take advantage of this.
So
That's my main point.
yeah, let's uh wha-
And
keep this.
the
Yeah,
data can help you out.
well, yes, that's what I wanted
So
to
for
get. So
example,
what is the data right
I
now?
just remember the trail. Yeah, I was going on a trail of thought, and I forgot exactly one part of it. But so one of the things I wanted to say was that on 9/11, if when people were looking at their television sets, they would have fared a whole lot better. Like we collectively as a nation would have done a whole lot better to that challenge if we had simply closed our ears and looked at the images that were being displayed on the screen. If we had completely ignored every single word that came out of the mouth of a newscaster, news reporter, some talking head, and just looked at what was actually happening, the actual data, the actual evidence that was being presented, we would have and focused on that. Then we would have done a whole lot better because instead of somebody telling us that, oh, these images that you are seeing are in fact, this thing that isn't true, that isn't real. They are in fact images of buildings that are collapsing due to fires. Um,
Well,
if
there
we
were
had looked at
planes
the
flying
images,
into them as well.
there were planes flying into them, yes, but there have been, planes flying into buildings. It's not the first time that's happened. The Empire State Building had a plane flying into it, and it was on fire for a long time, and it's just fine. Um,
Okay,
so
let's get to the corona part.
Yeah, so let's look
Are
at the data.
Yes.
I'd like to bring up this. One of our first exchanges that we had was about Italy and Italy's numbers. So,
Mhm.
one of the things that we should focus on right now is, what's exactly happening with the numbers coming out of these various different countries, and what are the numbers telling us?
Mhm.
And that's something that people can actually look at the same set of numbers and come to radically different conclusions about that. And I encourage people to look at the numbers and look at the various different conclusions that
Mhm.
others are coming to about these same numbers and see what sounds most reasonable to them. Because that's one thing that's being shoved in our face on a daily basis today is these numbers. And that in of itself is a form of psychological manipulation. Because if you are on a daily basis being exposed to the number of cases that are going up exponentially, supposedly, right? Then, well, that might freak you out. Like, is that a terrifying thing or not? Should you be freaked out or not? This is because when was the last time that we did this as collectively as a society? When was the last time was everyone glued to their screens looking at the numbers of, for example, of influenza? When did we decide to test for influenza numbers and make multiple websites and charts and graphs and then repeat stories on a daily basis on how, oh my God, the numbers for influenza are going up exponentially because they can do that with a different R0, they can do that. But we just ignore that story for usually right now it's what we're choosing to pay our attention to, and that in of itself is a form of psychological manipulation. Now this tweet specifically about Italy. So I wrote that according to the questionable numbers, Italy's CFR is 7.9%, Germany's CFR is 0.2%, Japan's, this was back in March 17th, Japan's is 3.3%, Switzerland's is 1%. All these CFRs are greater than reality, and what I mean by that was that
That's case fatality rates for those that don't know.
Right, yeah. So
CFR.
case fatality rate. In other words, it's the number of fatalities divided by the number of cases. So, and why I say that these CFRs are greater than reality is because certainly at that time, and even still to this day, we don't know the total number of cases. This is a point that I've seen others make, is that the looking at the number of cases is basically meaningless because the more you test, the more cases you're going to find, and the more the case fatality rate is going to drop over time because of that. So I was asking you, what are you saying exactly? That Germany's 0.2 CFR will become 7.9% in 1 to 2 weeks, and it just so happens that today it's exactly 2 weeks after that question was asked. And what has happened in that time? So you responded that, let's see, I'm going to skip a few tweets here, and you responded that, and it turned out, that we were both right. You said, but yes, it will go up if there aren't enough intensive care units, et cetera. Well, who knows if there turned out to be enough intensive care units or not. But the number did go up for Germany, but it did not go up to 7.9%. It went up.
I didn't expect it to go that high, by the way.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's
Okay.
easy to say that 2 weeks later, but I can
Yeah.
assure you I didn't expect that back then either.
Well, we can look at what happened in Italy, because there's some stories circulating now that are being discussed by people like James Corbett of the Corbett Report. Highly recommend that guy. He has been on 9/11 for such a long time and just constantly delivering amazing high quality content about 9/11. If you're interested about 9/11, James Corbett is one of the world's experts on that subject, and he has produced so much amazing content on that. And he's also right now covering the coronavirus, and he's very into analyzing propaganda. That seems to be like his thing at the moment. And one of the stories that he shared was from an Italian medical advisor to the ministry or something along those lines. And there was a story from the Telegraph. I have it here. Let me see if I can find it real quick. So yeah, from the Telegraph. The title of the story, if you want to search for it, before it's taken down. Hopefully, it doesn't get taken down. It's called "Why Have So Many Coronavirus Patients Died in Italy?" And it's from the Telegraph. That's a UK-based outlet.
Mhm.
And in it, he says something quite remarkable. Well, besides mentioning what has already been, widely circulated, that the patients are older, he said that on reevaluation of the National Institute of Health, only 12% of death certificates have shown a direct causality from coronavirus, while 88% of patients who have died have at least one pre-morbidity. Many had two or three. And then in James Corbett's episode that he put out today, I think, which I watched before this call, he actually shows those numbers from the PDF. And it was on the order of, it was like 50.7% had three other comorbidities. So what that means is that if you take Italy's numbers and you multiply them by 10%, you get a case fatality rate of around 1%, which is about in what every other country is showing.
I agree.
Which means, yeah, so that seems to be the CFR that people are, kind of settling in on around right now, is around 1%. And that, again, will go down with more testing, because there will be more people who, are said to have had the coronavirus, but they exhibited
that
no
part you're not sure
symptoms.
of. It may settle at around 1% in the end, including all the testing we can do. That's sort of
Maybe,
what,
yeah,
if you look at the
maybe.
South Korean numbers, for example, that's not so far of 1%, and they've done more testing there than anywhere.
Yeah, that's a
And
good
I would
point.
say
Yeah.
1% is pretty high. It's
It is.
or
It
do
is.
you
Yeah,
disagree?
that's another point. Yeah, that we should definitely cover in this call, is that multiple people can be right at the same time. So this is something else that people need to be careful with, is that when you see some people saying, "Oh, it's no big deal," and others saying it's the end of the world, well, you have to pay attention to both sides. You can't just dismiss one completely and go with one group and one narrative. You have to really look at the whole picture and see what the truth is. It could be the case that this COVID-19 is causing genuine damage and genuine harm, and is more dangerous than the flu by maybe an order of magnitude. And it could definitely be something that we need to be taking all sorts of precautions against. That could definitely be true. It could also be true that we're overreacting in some of our precautions. All of these things could be true simultaneously. So in times of uncertainty, it is foolish to be certain. Take some time for the dust to settle, before jumping to conclusions, and especially before jumping to solutions, because there are definitely going to be multiple parties right now pushing through their agendas, saying that we need to do this, we need to do that. And I see lots of people freaking out over that potential. things, especially like, for example, I should mention, a lot of people are freaking out about the possibility of mandatory vaccination. And I have no idea if they're going to suggest that or not,
Well,
but
let
there are good reasons.
me ask you a counter question then about this. How to deal in uncertainty. Forget about the solutions that people are offering or political solutions. Why? Let's keep it to yourself. Like, why wouldn't individuals personally decide to stay home, or if they go out, wear a mask? Or you're not gonna wait until the dust settles for that. You can just take immediate action yourself, right? Do you agree with that?
I completely agree. Yes. Um, there is definitely things, small, uh, harmless steps that you can do, completely reasonable steps that you can do to calm yourself down and calm other people down. Uh, Putting on, a face mask, which is common in Asia, seems to be a relatively low harm kind of a thing that you can do. It does help spread the transmission of not just COVID-19, but of various illnesses. And it's a reasonable, conscientious thing that you can do for others. People in Japan, for example, do it all the time. They wear face masks, not even, only when they're sick, but sometimes they do it just because, for example, they don't want to put on makeup, or for other reasons.
Okay, so
So things like that are perfectly reasonable, and they're also perfectly effective.
yes, what is the type of solution you're concerned about? Because clearly you're concerned about something.
Yes, I am concerned for a repeat of 9/11. Like, I don't want that to happen. That would really suck if we had, two 9/11s in a row where we don't learn our lessons from the previous situation where we reacted completely inappropriately. When there is an attack, you need to react somehow. But the lesson from 9/11 is that you need to put a little bit of thought before you pick which action you're going to take. If you don't do that, you're just going to dig yourself into a far deeper hole that it's going to take you decades to get out of.
So which
Um,
action should we not take right now?
well, mandatory vaccinations, to me, that's been a concern that I've heard people have. I think that that is definitely a valid, legitimate concern, because certainly vaccines have been proposed as a solution, and vaccines are effective at preventing diseases. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. But I, at the same time, completely understand the concerns that anti-vaxxers have, which are legitimate concerns for multiple reasons. First of all, yes, it is true that there are fake vaccines out there. For example, China has a serious problem with them. It is also true that some individuals will have adverse reactions to vaccines, and they should not take them. It is also true that vaccines are not, here, hold on a second. I had a really nice tweet on this, so I don't have to think about it and remember it during this call. Right, and the rest, right. So the other thing about vaccines is that they depend entirely on your existing immune system anyway. So the idea behind, in other words, a vaccine isn't something, it's not like a cure for uh, for a disease, and those are also being suggested, by the way, and those seem to me like they're also a legitimate potential solution. If you get an illness, I remember Trump recent, and also Elon Musk tweeted the same. I don't remember the name of this thing. It's like hydroxycolon something or other. That's effective for people who actually have COVID-19 and have reacted badly to it, because there are, we should mention repeatedly that there are people who get COVID-19 and whose immune system takes care of it just fine with, no problems whatsoever. These people, by the way, are the people who, if they want to be conscientious, should wear masks, because they can be symptomless transmitters of the illness to people with weaker immune systems, or who knows what else. So yeah, vaccines, making them mandatory can cause all kinds of unintended consequences. And the other thing is that it can potentially even lead to revolt, because there is a legitimately large number of people who are scared of like, if you have an effective solution, you don't need to force it on people, right? You can, Effective solutions typically are voluntary solutions. People want them because they sell themselves. They're clearly effective. They work, and so why do you need to be forced to do it if it's like an obvious no-brainer? Like nobody needs to force you. Most people agree that they need to eat, right? They don't need to be forced to eat. Um, some people, unfortunately, do sometimes, but for the most part, um, you know,
Okay, no forced
forcing a
vaccines.
solution isn't a good idea. That's basically all I wanted to say before we go on to 25 different branches.
Any other? So no forced vaccines. Any other solutions we should be wary of?
Let's see. Okay, so actually, that was the one that mainly jumped out at me because I could totally see how that could go horribly wrong. Another solution that we're currently doing that shouldn't be prolonged is lockdowns. I think that lockdowns, there's definitely strong arguments in favor of lockdowns because they do help prevent the spread of illness and disease. However, it is also a fact that if you lock down your country too long, you're going to destroy its economy and you're going to kill people. Like that's also a fact because a country cannot function if everyone is staying at home and not able to work, not able to produce goods and services, not able to feed themselves. That's like obviously a bad thing. We need to end this lockdown as soon as possible. And I think I don't like proposing solutions, but I do like to put them out there. I'm like, because I'm not an expert on this, right? I'm not an expert on I can't envision the future precisely, and nobody is. That's why we need to be having discussions between people about potential solutions and see if there are any problems with them. So if a lot of people are super concerned about the spread of this disease, something that can be done that's relatively, doesn't have too much harm. It can potentially have some harm as well, but it's like wearing masks, encouraging people to wear masks, maybe even telling people that they need to wear masks for like, a certain period of time at certain specific locations, and then restoring things to normal.
Why do you think the World Health Organization and several governments around the world are advising against masks?
Well, if you look at there's a big controversy going on now with the World Health Organization and also the CDC and this whole masks business. And they aren't exactly telling people not to wear masks. If you look at what they're actually saying, as far as I can tell, when I looked at the CDC guidelines, they said some perfectly reasonable things, which is that if you're sick, you should wear a mask. If you're, working with people who are sick, you should wear a mask. And then they also added, otherwise, you don't need to wear a mask. And I think it was that part that upset some people. And it's, I think, a technically true statement to some extent, but there's also the potential downside of, being one of those symptomless transmitters of disease. And that's one of the arguments that people are bringing up is that, well, if you're not sick, you can still be carrying this thing around and you can infect somebody else. So maybe you should wear masks. And I don't know why. I could guess as to why the CDC and the WHO are somewhat reluctant to say that. I've seen people offer theories on this point. I can
Well,
bring up
I'd love
one,
to hear him, Greg.
yeah. One theory that I think is perfectly reasonable is that we live in a kind of a surveillance society. And it wasn't too long ago that governments were pretty gung-ho about putting cameras everywhere up and crafting an Orwellian society where everybody is tracked and they use facial recognition and all of this other stuff. And if everybody's wearing masks, well, that could interfere with that plan. So maybe that's one of the reasons why they aren't too excited about that. And that's a debate that people are going to have. I just I hope people have debates, and come to, because it takes a while for a really good solution to manifest itself. Usually, what happens is the dumbest solutions are going to be suggested first, and it's going to take a while for us collectively to discuss and debate them and the pros and cons of everything before the better solutions start emerging, the more nuanced solutions. And I strongly think that the countries that react to COVID-19 with the most precision and nuance are going to be the ones that emerge from this with the least amount of harm.
Okay, to recap, just to make sure we didn't miss anything, no to forced vaccinations, no to long lockdowns, yes to masks.
That's my position. Yeah, that's my position. And it might not be, a well thought out position. Maybe somebody will have, some kind of reason why, that's not the right thing to do. Who knows? But that's where I think that's currently my position. Let's put it that way.
Okay, I want to get back to something else you hinted at earlier in the interview. Do you think it's possible or plausible that this virus was created, that it was an attack, that it was on purpose?
Okay, that's a really interesting question. So I've actually done a little bit of digging into that question. My parents are microbiologists, so I asked them what they thought about this question. In fact, I even sent them a preprint of a paper that talks about how this virus has some parts of its sequence resembling HIV, and how supposedly that's unlikely to happen in nature and whatnot. And I sent it to them. They had they looked through the paper and they were not convinced. And they said that that could definitely happen through some kind of coevolution. I'm not a microbiologist. This isn't my specialty at all. To be honest, I barely understood their response. But what I got from it was that they don't think so. After reading that paper, they were not at all convinced that there's any evidence that this was man-made. And that also does not mean that it wasn't man-made. It's just that there's no evidence, no strong proof, no strong evidence that it was in fact man-made. Um, so yeah, I don't know about that. However, there is some other interesting stuff that we could touch on. So I think I also sent you a video about a let's see, there have been a few different things. One was interesting, was that there was actually a couple of books that talk about this scenario happening. There was two books. There was one book that mentioned the virus happening from Wuhan. There was a Wuhan disease. It was later edited to be like emerging from Russia, but the original said that it was a Wuhan disease, and that was kind of interesting. This was a book from like 1970 something, I think. And there was another book that also predicted that in the year 2020 there would be, some kind of pandemic, and it would appear. It would quickly. It said that it would appear. It would then quickly disappear, and it would reemerge. I think about 10 years later, something along those lines. So we better watch out for the year 2030 if any of this nonsense comes back. Now, that's just one interesting factoid. There was also a video uploaded to YouTube, I think about 10 years ago, of a guy talking about how he supposedly knew some other guy who came to him, some anonymous source who happened to be in some Freemason meeting, some high-level Freemason meeting somewhere in London, and that he stumbled upon this meeting. He shouldn't have been there. It was a weird, strange meeting, and how they were laughing that China would catch a cold, was the quote. China would catch a cold.
Yeah, what was
Some sort of.
meeting?
What's that?
What was that meeting?
It was a high-level Freemason meeting. Are you familiar with the Freemasons?
Maybe not as much as you.
They're they're like a club slash cult slash some kind of a secret society type thing that exists in the United States, and apparently, in England as well, and probably has they have lodges. They're supposedly their members are supposedly joining there for like to do good works basically in the world, to do, kind of how many religions as well as many cults will do their best to do good. Sometimes they do good, sometimes not so good. Anyway, so he was supposedly at stumbled into a meeting he shouldn't have been in, had heard this, and so this is a video from 10 years ago, giving this story that China is going to catch a cold, haha, evil laughter, all of that stuff. Now, there's a lot of different ways you can interpret that story. You know, you could interpret that story as, oh, these people were planning to manufacture some kind of a biological weapon and release it in China. That's one way you could interpret the story. There's another way, like a less malicious way you could interpret the story is the sort of the wag the dog scenario, where, have you seen that movie, Wag the Dog?
No.
No, you need to watch that movie. It's fantastic. Explains a lot about politics. So, um, where it's basically social manipulation through the manipulation of attention and various other forms of manipulation. You can, for example, say that China will catch a cold. Well, does China catch a cold? Yes, China and every other country catches a cold every single freaking year. So you can simply, through the control of media, create a huge story out of a non-story, and create pandemonium, and then push through whatever agenda you want. So that could be another way. That would actually explain the laughter, because it is kind of funny that uh, China catches a cold is the story we're going to start working on, pushing on the narrative, and it is kind of funny that it's this is something that people are going to fall for. That's the funny part. It would be far less funny if they actually did engineer such a virus, but there's so far there isn't proof of that, as far as I can tell.
What do you think?
There are some quotes, by the way, from different professors. Like Off Guardian has a series. There's now, like, I think 22 professors or something like this who have spoken about this and are saying that we're overreacting. That there are let's see here. Let me look at some of these specific numbers. Right. So here's one from Dr. John Ioannidis of Stanford, who writes, could the COVID-19 case fatality rate be that low? No, some say, pointing to the high rate in elderly people. However, even some so-called mild or common cold type coronaviruses that have been known for decades can have case fatality rates as high as 8% when they infect elderly people in nursing homes. If we had not known, and then there's an ellipsis, meaning some has been taken out from the article where this is coming from. If we had not known about a new virus out there and had not checked individuals with PCR tests, the number of total deaths due to influenza-like illnesses would not seem unusual this year. At most, we might have casually noted that the flu this season seems to be a bit worse than average. So there's some supporting evidence for that. And again, I'm not saying that is the narrative you should take away from this podcast. There are so many different narratives that you can explore, that people are proposing, and that activity in of itself, I think, is healthy, to look at the various different narratives that people are proposing. And then out of all of that cacophony and pandemonium, with enough time, you can eventually find out the truth. But it's that process that's important right now, and that I'm kind of advocating, that process of stepping back from any one particular narrative and looking at all of them, to try and, if you're interested about COVID-19 and you want to get to the bottom of it, well, this is what you have to do. You don't really have much of another choice.
You shifted gears on me there, because we were talking about lab-created viruses, and then you went back to COVID specifically, right? But I wanted to ask you, what would be the reason for someone to create a virus like this? What's the incentive behind it? What's your speculation there?
So that's a big if it was created, and if it was released, in China or wherever. This isn't coming from me. This is coming from that guy in that video with Freemasons, and the theory there was that they wanted population reduction. So
In
that's
China or
another
just
narrative
everywhere?
you can explore. And I've heard multiple stories. I've heard even some people say that after having contracted and recovered from COVID-19, some people, and again, I don't know if this is true at all. So people need to check this. Should not take this at face value. It could be a lot of BS. that people are having trouble having kids afterwards. Who knows? Maybe it was an evil virus generated to sterilize the population. This is like an ancient, old kind of a narrative that's been out there for a long time. Maybe that we're seeing it in action now. Who knows? Maybe, because that's a valid concern. Systems, natural systems have carrying capacities, and once there's the tragedy of the commons. When you have too many people competing over a shared resource, they can deplete that resource and then cause all kinds of problems for themselves. So some people who might have that concern might decide, well, let's forcibly sterilize some percentage of the population and reduce the size of the human population to give the earth some breathing room. That's a possible narrative out there.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Just to be clear, you don't necessarily believe this. You're speculating. You're thinking out loud.
I'm not going to believe anything without like really strong, solid proof. And there isn't any of that right there out there. There's just a bunch of narratives. Like, I didn't take a strong stance on 9/11 until after years of study of all of the evidence that was being presented by both sides, the 9/11 truthers and the 9/11 BSers. So it took WTC7 footage, to really kind of shock me out of the initial CNN narrative. And then finally, with the University of Alaska actually modeling every single nut, bolt, and screw in that building, and then saying, absolutely not. NIST is completely wrong about this. There is no way that this building could have been brought down by fires, especially at free fall. Like, there's just such an infinitesimal chance that that could happen. And like that fits with, regular common sense and intuition. And here they spend $200,000 proving that fact, basically.
Okay, let me bring one more point up before we end this podcast. Getting back to the start, you were accusing me of creating panic, or at least that was sort of the
I was cautioning you. Yes, I was cautioning you. I was basically saying, like, don't jump on this. There was an initial panic, an initial narrative that was being spread throughout the internet. And
so let me be clear about that. I do think there is a problem. I do think there's something we should be concerned about. At the very least, there is an uncertainty that we should keep an eye on. Like, it's something we need to look at. I'm not necessarily advocating for a very specific solution, definitely not for a government enforced solution or any sort of totalitarian measures. If anything, I would like maybe especially sort of the Bitcoin type of people to take a note of what's going on and to think about it, because I think these are the type of people that can maybe come up with solutions that aren't these kind of totalitarian governments types of
that would be great.
Solutions. Ignoring the problem isn't going to make it go away. So it would be good.
I completely agree there with you. Yeah, I like when there is an attack, like there was an attack on 9/11, it would be obviously wrong to just ignore it and do nothing about it. I mean, I think people are going to demand some kind of reaction, some kind of justice, etc., to the attacks. And similarly with COVID-19, there clearly something happened to cause Italy to freak out and have a meltdown and something happened to cause France to freak out and also have a fairly high death rate compared to other countries. Something happened in Spain to have them have a high CFR. The high CFR countries, and there are a few of them. There are some countries with very high CFRs, and there are some countries with very low CFRs. And people need to get to the bottom of that. Why did some countries, have such high CFRs and others did not? Clearly, an attack of some kind happened. Clearly, people need to be paying attention to this and to protect themselves, for sure. I don't want to, also push too much in the other direction and say, oh, this is nothing. No. Something definitely has happened. And some kind of response is definitely warranted. We need to find the best solution that we can to this while minimizing harm.
All right. I think that's a good way to end this podcast, Greg. I thought this was very interesting. Thanks for being on.
Thank you, Aaron. And enjoy the rest of your evening.
Talk to you later somewhere. Cheers.
Ciao.